researching my father's family, the Mears family, that was quite well known in Maitland. And last year I went to Ypres in Belgium, and my first image is of the Menin Gate, where there are about 55 to 58,000 names of men who fought around in that battle around Ypres from 1914 to 1919, and the 55,000 names are just names of the missing. There's not a body to be seen. And two of my relatives were originally on that gate. But around about 1998, I was reading the Newcastle Morning Herald, and there was this face of a World War I soldier, and I thought, my goodness me, that's my father. And then I discovered a relative, Darryl, and together we've been researching the family. And we had to find out exactly where Stanley was buried, and that was a mystery for quite some time. And we found him because another researcher was searching for his family, and we found Stanley. He had been killed in 1917 and at Soma Farm, and he'd been buried originally by his mates in his battalion, the 35th Battalion. But unfortunately there was another battle and his grave was obliterated, and so he was one of the missing at the Menin Gate. And then a farmer was ploughing his land, and the remains of 4 young men came to the surface with their dog tags intact. And one of them was Stanley's. And none of the family had ever been able to go there. And so here I was searching for Stanley's grave because I still wasn't quite sure where Soma Farm was. And then I walked into a place at Ypres where they had battlefield tours. And I joined one. And there were only 3 of us on the tour. And so Christopher said, look, have you got any particular place that you want to go? And I told him my story about Stanley. And so he took me to Soma Farm. And there, right at the front gate of Soma Farm Cemetery, was Stanley's grave. And the sad thing is that he's not there alone. The 2 headstones are joined together. And whenever you see 2 headstones joined together, it means that there's no complete body there, but there will be pieces of body. So there are 4 young men buried in Stanley's grave. And while we're standing there, Christopher said, did Stanley have anybody else in the war? And I said, oh, yes, he had 3 brothers. One is buried somewhere, I don't know where this man is. And he rang back to the office and he said to his wife, Martine, can you tell me if Stanley has anybody else buried in this area? And then Christopher turned to me and said, Nola, is his name Percy Rowland Mears of East Maitland, the son of George Johnston Mears and Elizabeth Mears? And I said, oh my God, yes it is. And he said, he's buried in Reservoir Farm Cemetery, and that's on the other side of Ypres. I can't take you there, but you can find it. And so I did. I did a lovely walk around Ypres, and I came across Reservoir Cemetery. And right at the back of the cemetery is Percy's grave, and he was only 21. And the sad thing was that his older brother William, they were both in the same battalion, and he actually witnessed Percy getting wounded. And Percy was taken from the battlefield, and I've since learned that he had to have his leg amputated, and he died from that wound. And we had no idea where Percy was buried. So I was able to come back home and say, I found Percy, Darryl. But before I left Ypres, you can purchase these little wooden crosses. They're only about €1 each, and they've got a Flanders poppy on it. And so I went back to Soma Farm and I put a cross there for Stanley and one for Percy. And I just put on the bottom of Percy's, United at Last. And of course there were lots of tears. Also, Christopher found, by ringing back to the office, he found that Stanley's other brother, Edgar, was a miner at Hill 60. And you all know of the film that came out last year or the year before about Hill 60. Well, Edgar was a miner. Now, when you go to Hill 60, it was really amazing because Christopher told us that on the road facing no man's land, there would have been about 1,000 men in a battalion. And he said, Nola, walk across to halfway across no man's land, which I did. He said, now turn around and face the road. And he said, now, Nola, at least half of your battalion would have been dead or dying. And most of the officers would have been killed because they charge first. Then go through the gate. And I did that. And he said, now you've lost most of the rest of the battalion. You have about 10 men who are within grenade throwing distance. And facing them, Nola, is total machine gun fire. Now, I'm going to show you the crater. There were 19 mines dug under the Mezen Ridge. 19 mines. They dug them from 1915 till 1918. And it blew, when they all blew together, the sound was heard in London. It was like an atomic bomb. The Germans on the top of the ridge were vaporised. And underneath the crater at Hill 60, Christopher estimated that there is about 15,000 to 20,000 Germans dead under that ridge. And they've never been disturbed. And really, even though the Germans were the enemy, it is like walking on sacred ground. I think that got to me more than anything, that you're on sacred ground. And when you go to the German cemetery, it is so different. There are just black plaques on the ground. There's no flowers. The cemetery is just so dark and unforgiving. The British cemeteries, every grave has got some form of blossom, whether it's a rose or a carnation. And at Percy's grave, I noticed that there were some gardeners, some young men working as gardeners, and I went over to them and I said, pardon, do you speak English? And one fellow goes, oh, just a little, just a little. And I said, I just want to thank you on behalf of my family for tending these graves, because it gives me a lot of closure that my relatives are still being cared for here today, 90 odd years after the finish of this war. And next minute, I'm being embraced and cuddled and kissed by these young gardeners, because I said, you must be thanked so many times. And the fellow that could speak a little English said, no, we just work here. And I said, well, I thank you from the bottom of my heart. And we then drove to Villers-Bretonneux. And it's not until you climb to the top of the tower and you look out on the most beautiful farmland. It is so peaceful. And to know that our men are lying in this peaceful setting, I think that sort of brings home to you the sheer waste of war. I think that is the thing that came to me. So many young men. You walk amongst the graves, and if it has no name on it, it just has known only to God, known only to God, known only to God. And I went past and I touched these headstones, and I'm just thinking of these young men, 18, 19, 20. Very few. I mean, my relative Stanley was 25. That's relatively old. And I just felt that this is just such terrible waste. And at one stage, we actually went into a German trench. And looking out of the trench, you're looking over flat land and knowing that the British Imperial forces are running towards this trench that is loaded with machine guns. And I asked Christopher, I just said, how does anyone charge across no man's land faced with continual machine gun fire? How do you do that? How do you climb out of a trench, as you see in old films of World War One? How do you do that? And he said, Nola, you're in the army, you follow an order. And I said, I know, but that still doesn't really answer my question. And I just feel that when you go to EPAs, the minute you speak and they know you're an Australian, all of a sudden it's like you've won World War One, because they are so grateful for what the Australians, particularly the Australians, because we are such a friendly group, evidently, and we snub our nose at authority. That's also another beguiling thing about Australian soldiers. Didn't go over well with the hierarchy in the British Army. And at one stage, Christopher was singing the praises of a general, General Haig. And I had done a little bit of research on this man. And I actually said to Christopher, look, I don't want to tell you your job, but I would be very wary about telling Australians how wonderful General Haig is. Particularly, it'll be 100 years in 2014 since the beginning of this carnage. And he is down on record as saying, send in the colonials because they are dispensable. And the only colonials at that point were Australians. They had an incredible reputation for being tough fighting men. And they must have been. But I don't think they realised until they got to France, really. I mean, Gallipoli is a dreadful battle, but France is even worse in my book. And I just have this incredible connection with these two men who really are not my direct descendants. We, Stanley and Percy and myself, we share great-great-grandparents. Darryl, the relative that I met here, we have that same sharing, only we're just a little bit closer. But it's just amazing how affected I was by this historical situation of men, young men, fighting war, being led into battle by incompetent officers, and there were many. It wasn't until John Monash came in charge of the Australian troops that I think the Australians really had somebody leading them who understood them and who knew battle strategy. I just feel that it's been an amazing experience to go back and link with these two men, these two young men. And I just remembered that Percy, when he was killed, that his death was witnessed by his older brother. And William wrote back to home and said, please don't send any more. Nobody from the family, please don't send any more. And I think that was the general feeling of a lot of men who were fighting in France.